1298. The Palazzo San Giorgio, Genoa. The air in the cell is thick, a damp cocktail of cold stone, brackish seawater seeping through the walls, and the slow, metallic scent of despair. Light struggles through a high, barred window, painting a weak rectangle on the floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the gloom like lost souls. This is not a dungeon for common criminals. It is a place of holding for prisoners of war, a consequence of the eternal, grinding conflict between the maritime republics of Genoa and Venice. Here, amidst the low murmur of defeated men and the distant cry of gulls, a Venetian merchant, a captain of a galley captured in a naval skirmish, sits not in silent misery, but in a fury of recollection. His name is Marco Polo, a man in his mid-40s, his face weathered not just by the Mediterranean sun, but by the harsher glare of deserts and the biting winds of high plateaus. He speaks, and his voice, though tired, is a torrent. His words paint pictures that have no place in this drab Genoese prison. He speaks of palaces with roofs of solid gold, of black stones that burn like wood, of immense cities where 1 million people throng the streets. His cellmate, a writer from Pisa named Rusticello, a professional weaver of chivalric romances and epic tales, scribbles furiously, the scratching of his quill a counterpoint to the Venetian's hypnotic monologue. The Pisan understands stories, but these are something else entirely. They are too vast, too detailed, too impossible. This moment, in this damp prison cell, is the crucible. This is not a catastrophe for Marco Polo. It is his greatest opportunity. The journey is over, but the legend is about to be forged, born from the unlikely union of a world-weary merchant and a professional dreamer. The story being dictated is a key, one that will unlock the imagination of a continent, but it is also a mirror, and no one yet knows if it reflects a real world or merely the boundless ambition of the man telling the tale. This is the narrative of him, Marco Polo, the man who brought the Orient out of the realm of myth and placed it onto the map of the known world. This was the saga of a merchant who returned to Venice, not just with silks and jewels, but with a story so vast it would earn him the nickname Il Milione, the man of 1,000,000 stories, or, as his skeptical countrymen preferred, 1,000,000 lies. To understand this man, we must stand with him in that Genoese prison and ask the central dramatic question that echoes through the centuries. Who was the real traveler, and who was the fiction? Was he the meticulous observer, the first true European ethnographer and geographer of the East, whose detailed accounts of Yuan China would be verified by scholars 700 years later? Or was he the ultimate fabulist, a brilliant storyteller who perhaps never ventured much farther than the trading posts of the Black Sea, and who masterfully wove together the tales of other, less eloquent travelers into an epic where he cast himself as the hero? The paradox is this: the man who told Europe about an unseen world may have been the one man who hadn't truly seen it all himself. We must delve into his life, his journey, and his book not merely as a historical record, but as a psychological drama. The core question is not what he saw, but how he constructed his vision. Was his book a testament, or was it the greatest literary fraud in history, a deception so masterful that it changed the very course of civilization? Our journey is to separate the man from the myth, the eyewitness from the showman, and to find the truth of a figure who stands forever at the crossroads of reality and imagination. To understand the man, we must first return to the world that spawned him. The mid-13th century was a time of violent, radical transformation, a world teetering on the edge of a new age. The Europe Marco Polo was born into was a place of profound limitations and deep anxieties. It was a continent turned inward, a patchwork quilt of feudal domains where the authority of kings was constantly challenged by powerful nobles. The grand unifying projects of the past were crumbling. The Crusader states in the Levant, Europe's centuries-long foothold in the East, were in their death throes, about to be swept away by the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mediterranean, that ancient basin of civilization, was not a highway, but a battlefield, the scene of a brutal commercial war between the Italian maritime republics. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa were city-states built on oceanic trade, their fleets like packs of wolves fighting over the lucrative trade routes to the Black Sea and Egypt, the traditional gateways for the trickle of spices and silks that reached the West. But beyond this familiar world of conflict and commerce lay a vast, terrifying unknown. Just a generation before Marco's birth, Europe had been traumatized by the Mongol invasions. The Golden Horde had shattered the armies of Hungary and Poland, reaching the Adriatic coast before mysteriously receding. To the European mind, the Mongols were a divine scourge, the apocalyptic hordes of Gog and Magog. Yet, in the decades that followed, this terror slowly morphed into a grudging understanding. The Mongol conquests, for all their brutality, had created something unprecedented: the Pax Mongolica. A single colossal empire, stretching from the borders of Poland to the shores of the Pacific, had pacified the ancient Silk Road. For the first time in 1,000 years, a traveler could, in theory, journey from the Black Sea to China in relative safety, under the authority of a single ruler, the Great Khan. This empire was a source of immense fear, but also of irresistible allure, a civilization of unimaginable scale and wealth, a potential Christian ally against Islam, and a commercial opportunity beyond any merchant's wildest dreams. It was a world waiting for a narrator, a black box of myth and rumor that needed a European voice to give it shape and meaning. Into this world of fear and opportunity, Marco Polo was born, a child of the Rialto, the vibrant commercial heart of the Venetian Republic. He was born into the merchant class, a unique aristocracy of commerce, where lineage was measured not in land, but in successful voyages and profitable ledgers. The Polo family was not of the highest Venetian nobility, but they were respected, ambitious traders. For Marco, the scent of his childhood would have been the exotic aroma of the Fondaco dei Tedeschi and the other warehouses lining the Grand Canal, the sharp tang of pepper from the Malabar coast, the sweet perfume of cloves from the Spice Islands, the earthy smell of silk from lands no one in Venice had ever seen. But his was a childhood defined by absence. His father, Niccolo, and his uncle Maffeo were specters, mythic figures who had vanished into the East before he was old enough to form memories of them. He was raised by his extended family, growing up on whispers and rumors of his father's journey to the court of the Great Khan. This upbringing forged in him a unique psychology. Unlike other Venetian boys who learned the family trade at their father's side, Marco learned of the world through second-hand stories, through the lens of saga and legend. His father wasn't just a merchant, he was an adventurer, a character in a story. This instilled in the young Marco a profound understanding of the power of narrative. Furthermore, he grew up with an intense need to connect with, and perhaps even surpass, his absent father. He had to prove he was worthy of the Polo name, not just as a trader, but as a protagonist. This deep-seated ambition, this desire to transform the mundane business of commerce into an epic, is crucial to understanding the man he would become. He was not just trained to calculate profits and assess goods. He was primed to see the world as a stage for a grand adventure, a predisposition that would later blur the lines between what he experienced and what he narrated. The first step into this great game, The moment the boy's life pivots from Venetian reality to global epic came in the year 1271. Niccolò and Maffeo Polo had finally returned from their first decade-long odyssey, materializing in Venice like ghosts from another world. They brought with them not just wealth, but a story that beggared belief and, more importantly, a direct summons from the most powerful man on the planet, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the vast Mongol Empire. The Khan, a man of great intellectual curiosity, had been fascinated by the two Venetians and had tasked them with a mission of world historical importance. They were to return to Europe, go to the Pope, and request 100 learned men, missionaries, engineers, scholars, to bring the knowledge of the West to his court. They were also to bring back holy oil from the lamp at the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. This was no mere trading venture. It was a diplomatic embassy of the highest order, an attempt to bridge two worlds, and this time they would not go alone. A 17-year-old Marco, who had spent his entire life waiting for this moment, was to join them. For the young man, this was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream, the chance to step into the legend that had shaped his entire existence. The departure from Venice was a spectacle, the beginning of a journey that would take 3.5 years and cover thousands of miles. They traveled not as humble merchants seeking profit, but as envoys of the great Khan, carrying his golden paisa, a tablet of authority that granted them safe passage, lodging, and horses throughout the vast Mongol domains. This context is critical. From the very beginning, Marco's journey was framed not by commerce, but by imperial power and diplomatic intrigue. He was not an outsider looking in. He was an invited guest, traveling with the full protection and prestige of the Mongol state. This unique status would grant him access to a world closed off to almost all other foreigners, but it would also shape his perspective, ensuring he saw the East not through the eyes of a commoner, but through the privileged lens of the ruling elite. Behind every great ambition lies an inner demon, a secret motivation that fuels the relentless drive forward. For Marco Polo, it was not merely the siren call of adventure or the merchant's lust for gold. His deepest motivation was a profound, burning need to prove himself and to etch his family's name not just into the ledgers of Venetian commerce, but into the annals of history itself. He was the son of a ghost, a father who was more legend than man. He had to live up to the larger-than-life tales of Niccolò and Maffeo. Simply returning as a wealthy man would not be enough. Other Venetians had done that. He needed to return with something more valuable than silk or spices, a story that no one else could tell. This was his psychological quest, to transform the Polo family from successful traders into figures of historical consequence. He saw that the world was changing, that the Pax Mongolica had created a unique, fleeting opportunity to witness a civilization that dwarfed Europe in size, power, and sophistication. He understood, perhaps intuitively, that the man who could accurately describe this world, who could map its wonders and explain its systems, would achieve a form of immortality. This ambition explains the very nature of his book. It is not a personal diary filled with introspection and feeling. It is a methodical, almost encyclopedic account of places, customs, economies, and power structures. He is constantly measuring, counting, and evaluating. This is the mind of a merchant, yes, but it is also the mind of a man building a case, assembling a body of evidence to prove the unbelievable. His inner drive was to be the ultimate authority, the final word on the East. This desire to be the definitive source, the man who saw everything and recorded everything, might also be the key to his greatest fictions. Where there were gaps in his own experience, his ambition may have compelled him to fill them with the stories of others, presenting them as his own to create the illusion of a complete, seamless, and unparalleled journey. His secret motivation was not to lie, but to construct a truth so grand and comprehensive that it would be unassailable, ensuring his place as the sole narrator of a previously silent world. The fulcrum upon which Marco Polo's entire life in the East would pivot was his fateful encounter with the great Khan himself, Kublai. After a grueling 3.5-year journey across deserts and mountains, the Polos finally arrived at the Khan's magnificent summer palace in Chengdu, a place that would later be immortalized in the Western imagination as Xanadu. They were not brought before the Khan as dusty, supplicant merchants. They were received as long-awaited ambassadors. The teenage Marco, now a young man of 21, stood before a figure of almost divine power. Kublai Khan was in his 60s, the ruler of an empire that stretched from the Pacific to Mesopotamia. He was no longer the nomadic warrior of his grandfather's generation. He was a sophisticated administrator, a patron of arts and science, a ruler grappling with the immense challenge of governing a sedentary, ancient Chinese civilization with a Mongol military machine. The chronicler tells us that the Khan was immediately taken with the young Marco. While Niccolo and Maffeo were capable merchants, Marco possessed a different quality. He was observant, intelligent, and had a remarkable facility for languages. Kublai, who was deeply curious about the lands he ruled but could not always visit, saw in Marco a perfect instrument. He found the reports of his own Mongol administrators to be dull and limited, focused only on the business at hand. Marco, however, could provide him with something more: the texture of the world, the strange customs of his subjects, the interesting anecdotes, and local legends. According to the book, the Khan began to use Marco as his personal emissary, a trusted agent sent on missions to the farthest flung corners of his empire, to the remote provinces of Yunnan and Tibet, to the borders of Burma, and perhaps even to the shores of India. This relationship was the key to everything. It transformed Marco from a foreign traveler into an imperial insider. He was not just observing the Mongol Empire, he was actively participating in its administration. This patronage gave him a unique vantage point, but it also defined the limits of his vision. He saw the empire as Kublai saw it, from the top down, a world of cities, trade routes, tax revenues, and political structures. This was the world he would later describe, a world seen through the eyes of a privileged agent of the court, a fact that both legitimized his account and perhaps explains its most glaring omissions. Having gained the trust of the great Khan, Marco Polo's life transformed dramatically. He was no longer a mere guest at the court. He became a functionary of the Mongol imperial machine, an agent of the Yuan dynasty. This is the period of his life that forms the core of his book, and also the source of the greatest controversy. Il Milione claims that Marco was appointed to high office, serving as a trusted advisor, and even as the governor of the great city of Yangzhou for 3 years. This is a staggering assertion. The idea of a young, unknown foreigner being placed in charge of a major Chinese administrative center seems almost incredible. Chinese records from the period, which are remarkably detailed, contain no mention of a Polo serving in any such capacity. This silence is one of the most powerful arguments used by skeptics. However, the narrative of his service, whether literally true or not, reveals a deeper truth about his role. He became an instrument of Mongol power. The Yuan dynasty ruled over a vast and resentful Chinese population and often preferred to use foreigners, Persians, Arabs, Turks, and perhaps a few Europeans, as administrators, tax collectors, and envoys, as they had no local loyalties and were entirely dependent on the Khan. It is highly plausible that Marco served in this capacity, perhaps not as a full governor, but as an inspector, a special emissary, or a salt tax official. roles that would have required extensive travel. He claims to have journeyed on imperial business through the provinces of Cathay, North China, and Manzi, South China, describing their cities, their commerce, and their people with a merchant's eye for detail. He was not an explorer in the modern sense, charting unknown territory for the sake of discovery. He was traveling along the highly developed arteries of the Mongol communication and trade network, observing the empire from the inside. This was the price of his access. His journey was not his own. It was dictated by the needs of the Khan. He saw what the empire wanted him to see, traveled where he was sent, and understood the world through the framework of Mongol administration. His power and position were entirely derived from the Khan, a fact that gave him unparalleled insight, but also colored his entire perception of the East. The true antagonist of Marco Polo's saga was not a person, not a rival merchant, nor a hostile warlord. His greatest adversary was a vast, silent, and deeply skeptical world he had left behind. His enemy was the very structure of the medieval European mind, a worldview that was profoundly insular, dogmatic, and resistant to facts that did not fit its established theological framework. To the average 13th century European, the world was small, centered unequivocally on Jerusalem, and populated by the familiar figures of scripture and classical myth. The lands beyond the Islamic world were a realm of fantasy, inhabited by monstrous races described by Pliny the Elder and the monstrous peoples from the legends of Prester John. Into this constricted intellectual space, Marco Polo would attempt to introduce a reality that was simply too large to be accepted. He described a city, Hangzhou, that was by his estimation over 100 miles in circumference, with 12,000 stone bridges, a figure so immense that it dwarfed Venice, Paris, and Rome combined. He spoke of a ruler, the Great Khan, whose wealth and power made every European king look like a petty chieftain. He described the burning of black stones, coal for fuel, the use of paper money as currency, and an imperial postal system of breathtaking efficiency. These were not fables of dog-headed men, though his book included some of those too, likely picked up from Eastern legends. These were detailed, sober descriptions of a highly advanced, complex, and wealthy secular civilization. To his contemporaries, these truths were far more unbelievable than any fantasy. The sheer scale of what he described was an assault on their sense of place in the world. His antagonist was, therefore, the very limit of the European imagination. He was a man out of time, a bearer of empirical data in an age of faith and fable. He understood that the more truth he told, the more he would be branded a liar. This central conflict would define his legacy, forcing him to fight a battle not against swords or spears, but against the deeply ingrained disbelief of his own culture, a battle that would continue long after his death. At the very heart of the paradox of Marco Polo lies a series of staggering and deeply problematic omissions. These are the fatal mistakes in his testimony, the cracks in the foundation of his credibility that have haunted his reputation for 700 years. For a man who claims to have spent 17 years as a high-level official in Yuan China, a man whose book is celebrated for its meticulous detail, he fails to mention some of the most fundamental and ubiquitous aspects of Chinese civilization. First and foremost is the Great Wall. While the massive stone structure we know today is largely a product of the later Ming dynasty, extensive earthen walls, barriers, and fortifications existed and were certainly visible in Polo's time. How could a man who traveled so extensively throughout northern China fail to notice or comment upon such a significant feature? The silence is deafening. Equally baffling is the complete absence of tea. By the 13th century, tea was not just a beverage in China. It was a cornerstone of the culture, the economy, and daily ritual, from the most elaborate court ceremonies to the humblest peasant's meal. For a man so interested in customs and commerce to ignore it entirely is akin to describing Italy without mentioning wine or pasta. Furthermore, his account is silent on the practice of foot binding, the painful and widespread custom that shaped the lives of countless Chinese women. And perhaps most astonishingly of all, he never once mentions the complex system of Chinese characters, the very foundation of the civilization's literature, philosophy, and administration. These omissions are not minor details. They are fundamental pillars of the culture he claimed to know so intimately. This is the psychological breaking point for any student of his story. We are forced to confront the possibility that his experience of China was far more superficial than he lets on. Did he live primarily within a bubble of foreign administrators, never truly engaging with the deep culture of the Han Chinese? Was he confined to the major cities and trade routes, never venturing into the countryside where the Great Wall snaked across the hills? Or is this silence the ultimate proof that he was never really there at all, and that his knowledge was based on second-hand accounts from Persian merchants who, for their own reasons, did not discuss these aspects of the land? Here, the narrative must pivot from accepting the hero's story to questioning it, entering the shadow of doubt that defines his legacy. Just as chaos had defined the world that propelled him eastward, it was chaos that would provide his path home, and, in a strange twist of fate, grant him the opportunity to witness a whole new dimension of the Asian world. After 17 years in the Khan's service, the Polos, Niccolo, Maffeo, and Marco, were wealthy and respected, but they were also aging and increasingly anxious to return to Venice. Kublai Khan was old, and they feared that upon his death, his successors might not view the foreign Christians with the same favor. Getting permission to leave, however, was difficult, as the Khan had grown dependent on their services. Their opportunity came from a crisis unfolding on the western edge of the Mongol world. The ruler of the Ilkhanate in Persia, Arghun Khan, had requested a new bride from the lineage of Kublai Khan in China. A beautiful Mongol princess named Kokochin was chosen, and a grand escort was prepared to take her overland to Persia. However, the land route was now plagued by war and instability among the various Mongol successor states. The overland journey was deemed too dangerous. This is when Marco, who had apparently just returned from a long sea voyage to India, stepped in. He argued that the sea route, while long, was now the safest option. His recent experience convinced the court, and the Polos were entrusted with their most important mission yet, to escort the princess by sea from the port of Quanzhou in southern China all the way to the Persian Gulf. This unexpected detour was a blessing in disguise for the narrator. The 2-year sea voyage took them through a world entirely different from the overland Silk Road. They sailed through the South China Sea, visited the kingdoms of Champa, modern Vietnam, and Sumatra, traversed the Straits of Malacca, and called on the rich ports of the Malabar coast of India and Ceylon. This journey, born of political chaos, provided Marco with the material for the most exotic and, importantly, some of the most verifiable sections of his book. His descriptions of the port cities, the spice trade, the local customs, and the navigational challenges of the Indian Ocean were detailed and largely accurate. This chaotic turn of events allowed him to complete his portrait of Asia, adding the vibrant, teeming world of the maritime Silk Road to his account of the continental Mongol Empire, immeasurably enriching the tale he would one day tell a skeptical Europe. The greatest triumph of Marco Polo's life was not his 17-year sojourn in China, nor his arduous journey home, nor the wealth he brought back to Venice. His ultimate, world-changing victory was forged not in the opulent palaces of the East, but in the grim, damp confines of a Genoese prison. It was here, in 1298, that his memories, experiences, and perhaps his inventions were transmuted into something permanent and powerful: a book. His collaboration with his cellmate, Rustichello da Pisa, was a stroke of historical genius, a perfect fusion of content and form. Marco was the witness, the repository of unprecedented knowledge, a man whose head was overflowing with the sights, sounds, and statistics of a continent. But he was a merchant, not a writer. Rustichello, on the other hand, was a professional storyteller, a scribe whose stock in trade was the chivalric romance, the epic tales of knights, battles, and wondrous quests that were the popular literature of the day. He knew how to structure a narrative, how to build suspense, and how to frame a story in a way that would captivate an audience. He took Marco's raw, often dry and encyclopedic recollections and shaped them into The Description of the World, a title that would later be eclipsed by its popular nickname, Il Milione. Rustichello was the filter through which the story was told. He likely added the epic flourishes, the conventional phrases, "What shall I tell you?" and perhaps even encouraged the inclusion of the more fantastical elements, the tales of dog-headed men in the Andaman Islands or the giant rock birds of Madagascar, because he knew that such wonders were expected in a tale of distant lands. This act of creation was Marco's true coronation. The book, not the journey itself, was what made him immortal. It was a vessel that could carry his story across time and space, long after his personal memories had faded and his physical treasures had been dispersed. In that prison, he ceased to be merely a returned traveler and became the definitive author of the East, his personal account now codified as objective truth for an entire continent. This was the pinnacle of his achievement, the moment his life was laundered through literature to become a legend. With the creation of the book came a profound psychological shift in Marco Polo himself. In the process of dictating his life story, he was not just remembering the past, he was actively constructing his own legend. This is the moment of hubris, the point at which the storyteller becomes so captivated by his own tale that it solidifies into an unshakable, personal truth. As he spoke to Rustichello, surrounded by the grim reality of his prison cell, the chaotic, fragmented, and perhaps morally ambiguous experiences of his 17 years abroad were polished and arranged into a grand, heroic narrative. He was no longer just a clever merchant who had found favor at a foreign court. He became Messer Marco Polo, the wise and indispensable counsel to the most powerful emperor on earth, the trusted governor, the intrepid explorer. He became the hero of his own romance. The nickname he acquired upon his return, Il Milione, perfectly captures this duality. To his supporters, it meant he was the man of 1,000,000 stories, a figure of immense worldly experience. To his detractors, it meant he was the man of 1,000,000 lies. But for Marco, it may have become a badge of honor, a testament to the sheer, overwhelming scale of the reality he had witnessed. He likely came to believe that any exaggerations or compilations in his story were not falsehoods, but necessary devices to convey a truth that was simply too large for ordinary language. How else could he explain the city of Hangzhou to a Venetian who had never seen a town with more than 100,000 people? How could he describe the power of Kublai Khan to men who thought the Holy Roman Emperor was the ultimate authority? He may have felt that a literal, sober account would have been a greater lie, a betrayal of the magnificent scale of what he had seen. This conviction became his shield. He internalized the persona of Marco Milione, the man who had seen it all. This wasn't necessarily a cynical deception, but the psychological defense of a man whose reality had become so extraordinary that it sounded like fiction, forcing him to embrace the role of the fabulist in order to feel he was telling the truth. While the distant, abstract antagonist of his story was the limited imagination of medieval Europe, his immediate and most persistent enemies were far closer to home. They were his own neighbors, the fellow merchants and nobles of Venice. Upon his return in 1295, after an absence of 24 years, the Polos were met not with a hero's welcome, but with suspicion and ridicule. According to a story recounted by the humanist Giambattista Ramusio centuries later, they arrived at their family home in ragged Tartar clothes, speaking a clumsy, accented Venetian. Their own relatives failed to recognize them and refused them entry. To prove their identity, the Polos hosted a grand banquet. With each course, they would theatrically slash open the linings of their worn garments, releasing a river of jewels, rubies, diamonds, emeralds, and sapphires that they had sewn into the seams. The spectacle stunned their guests and re-established their wealth, but it did little to quell the disbelief surrounding their stories. In the fiercely competitive and gossip-ridden society of Venice, Marco became a peculiar local character. He was Messer Marco Milione, a nickname that dripped with sarcasm. He was the man to be humored at dinner parties, the source of outlandish tales for the city's amusement. His most intimate and sworn enemies were, therefore, the collective common sense of his own people. Every person who smirked at the mention of paper money, every patrician who chuckled at the idea of a city with 12,000 bridges, was a personal antagonist. This battle against mockery culminated in the famous scene on his deathbed. As he lay dying in 1324, surrounded by family and a priest, he was urged to recant his fables and save his soul. His response was not a confession, but a final, defiant stand against the small-mindedness that had plagued him for decades. "I have not told," he whispered, "half of what I saw." In this moment, his personal drama reached its climax. His sworn enemy was not a rival on the battlefield, but the stubborn refusal of his world to grow large enough to accommodate his truth. While Marco Polo enacted no reforms in the manner of a legislator or a king, his book, The Description of the World, functioned as a revolutionary document that fundamentally reconstructed the European worldview. Its impact was not immediate, but grew steadily, like a slow-acting poison, undermining the old, claustrophobic geography of the medieval mind. Before Polo, European maps of Asia were largely conjectural, filled with the monstrous races of legend and vast, empty spaces labeled terra incognita. Il Milione changed all of that. It was not a precise scientific treatise, but it was a practical guide, a gazetteer of a real and functioning world. It populated the blank spaces on the map with the names of specific places: Kashgar, Cathay, Tsipangu, Hormuz. It described their locations relative to one another, the typical travel times between them, their primary products, their systems of currency, and the customs of their people. For the first time, Europe was presented with a detailed, secular, and economically focused portrait of the Far East. The effect on the architects of the coming age of discovery was profound and direct. The book became required reading for the ambitious and the curious. Prince Henry the Navigator, the great patron of Portuguese exploration, possessed a copy. Most famously, Christopher Columbus owned a heavily annotated Latin edition, which he carried with him on his voyage across the Atlantic. Columbus's personal notes reveal a man obsessed with Polo's descriptions. He read of the immense wealth of Cathay and the island of Tsipangu, Japan, which Polo described as having a palace roofed with finest gold. It was this vision, this tangible promise of unimaginable riches, that fueled Columbus's relentless quest for a westward route to the Indies. He sailed west not into a complete unknown, but with Marco Polo's map of Asia firmly imprinted on his mind, believing he could reach the lands the Venetian had described. In this sense, Polo's book was a foundational text of modernity. It did not create laws, but it created a new mental geography, shifting Europe's focus from the Mediterranean to the vast possibilities of a global stage. It provided the blueprint and, more importantly, the motivation for the voyages that would shatter the old world forever. After the epic sweep of his journey and the intellectual triumph of his book, Marco Polo's later life appears almost shockingly mundane, a quiet denouement to a spectacular drama. He returned to Venice a man of considerable wealth, no longer the boy who had left a quarter century earlier. He did not, however, leverage his fame or knowledge to become a major political figure. Instead, he settled back into the life of a Venetian patrician. He married a woman named Donata Badour from a respected noble family, and with her had 3 daughters, Fantina, Belela, and Moretta. He engaged in several lawsuits, managed his fortune, and lived out his remaining decades in the family home in the parish of San Giovanni Crisostomo. This quiet, domestic existence stands in stark contrast to the grand persona of his book. Yet, beneath the surface of this conventional life, the legacy of his journey was ever present. He held on to the physical evidence of his travels with a fierce, almost desperate tenacity. His last will and testament, a document that survives to this day, is a fascinating window into his mind. Alongside the standard bequests of Venetian ducats to his wife, daughters, and various religious institutions, he lists specific, exotic items brought back from the East. Most significantly, he mentions the golden paisa, the tablet of command given to him by the great Khan, which had been the symbol of his authority and safe passage throughout the Mongol Empire. He also bequeaths to his wife the Tartar-style clothes and jewelry he had brought back. These were not just souvenirs, they were his relics, the tangible proofs of his incredible story in a world that largely dismissed it as fantasy. He clung to these objects as a way of validating his own history. His quiet life was, in its own way, a constant silent battle to preserve the truth of his epic past amidst the encroaching tide of Venetian skepticism. He had returned from the court of the world's greatest emperor only to live out his days as a peculiar local celebrity, the rich and eccentric Messer Milione. For over a century, Marco Polo's book stood as a unique, if controversial, monument, the singular, comprehensive European account of the Far East. However, as the 14th century progressed, the first cracks in its authority began to appear, not from outright refutation, but from the slow accumulation of other, conflicting testimonies. The Pax Mongolica, while it lasted, allowed not only merchants, but also Franciscan and Dominican missionaries to venture deep into Asia. These men were driven by faith, not commerce, and their written accounts, intended for their religious superiors, had a different tone and focus. One of the most important was the Friar Odoric of Pordenone, who traveled to China some 50 years after Polo. Odoric's account corroborates many aspects of Polo's description of Mongol China, lending it credibility. However, he also describes things that Polo omits, most notably the custom of foot binding, which he details with horrified fascination. Another crucial voice was Giovanni de Marignoli, a papal legate who spent 4 years in Beijing. His writings are more scholarly and critical, and they subtly challenge the grandiosity of Polo's narrative. These accounts, and others like them, began to create a more complex and nuanced picture of the East. They were often less epic, more focused on the daily life and religious customs of the people. They mentioned the small, telling details that were absent from Polo's grand, top-down survey. This growing body of literature did not brand Polo a liar, but it implicitly questioned his status as the sole, omniscient authority. It suggested that his experience, while remarkable, was not the only one, and perhaps not even the most complete one. These new voices were the harbingers of the storm of skepticism that would eventually engulf Polo's reputation. They created a conflict of interpretations, a landscape of competing narratives, where Polo's version, once the entire map, was now just one route among many, and not always the most reliable one. The single most fateful act in the entire saga of Marco Polo, the decision that would shape his legacy and forever blur the line between fact and fiction, was his choice of collaborator in that Genoese prison. In teaming up with Rustichello da Pisa, he made a pact with the art of storytelling itself, a decision with consequences he may not have fully understood. Had he written the book himself, it might have been a dry, factual merchant's ledger, a valuable historical document certainly, but one that might have been read by a few scholars and then forgotten. Rustichello transformed it. As a professional writer of chivalric romances, his entire craft was built on the conventions of epic literature. He knew that a story needed a hero, grand quests, moments of wonder, and a sense of narrative momentum. He instinctively filtered Marco's recollections through this literary lens. The psychology of this decision is key. Did Marco, frustrated by the initial disbelief he faced in Venice, deliberately choose a romance writer to make his story more palatable, more exciting, and ultimately more believable to a public weaned on tales of fantasy? Or was he a willing participant in the embellishment, seeing it as the only way to do justice to the sheer grandeur of what he had witnessed? It's also possible that Marco's own memory, after years of retelling his stories, had already begun to romanticize the past. The collaboration with Rustichello simply codified this process. This act explains the book's bizarre and unique hybrid nature. It is part detailed gazetteer, with precise descriptions of trade goods and distances, and part medieval fantasy, with tales of mythical beasts and distant kings. This fateful decision ensured the book's wild popularity and its survival, but it came at a terrible cost to its author's credibility. He prioritized a good story over a strictly factual account. In doing so, he created a masterpiece that would inspire Columbus, but he also forged the chains of his own reputation as Il Milione, the great fabulist. He won the battle for an audience, but in the long run, he risked losing the war for his own authenticity. The greatest catastrophe of Marco Polo's life was not a shipwreck, a lost fortune, or a political downfall. It was a slow, creeping intellectual disaster, the posthumous verdict of history that branded him a liar. While he faced skepticism in his own lifetime, the centuries following his death saw this doubt harden into a near-universal consensus among many educated people. His name, once a byword for wondrous discovery, became synonymous with fantastic exaggeration. In his own Venice, the phrase "L'è un Marco Polo," "it's a Marco Polo," entered the vernacular as a common way to dismiss a story as a tall tale. The very book that was his life's crowning achievement became the primary evidence against him. As more reliable and sober accounts of China began to filter into Europe, especially after the establishment of direct sea routes in the 16th century, the inconsistencies and omissions in Polo's work became more glaring. Scholars and travelers who had actually seen the Great Wall, who understood the significance of tea, and who were familiar with the Chinese writing system, looked back at Il Milione with deep suspicion. How could the great eyewitness have missed so much? His reputation suffered a profound collapse. He was relegated to the status of a purveyor of entertaining fables, a medieval storyteller rather than a reliable geographer. This was a catastrophe of the spirit, a tarnishing of his entire legacy. The man who had risked everything to bring back a true picture of a new world was remembered primarily for his fictions. His greatest triumph, the telling of the story, had contained the seeds of his greatest defeat. The epic scope and literary flourishes that made his book a medieval bestseller were the very things that made it seem untrustworthy to later, more critical ages. His name became a monument not to discovery, but to the unreliability of a good story. The final scene of the drama, the moment of collapse, brings us full circle to the psychological core of our hero. It is the year 1324, and Marco Polo is on his deathbed in Venice. The grand adventurer who had crossed the roof of the world and served at the court of the planet's mightiest emperor is now a wealthy but tired old man of nearly 70. His world has shrunk to the size of a single room, the air thick with the scent of incense and impending death. Surrounding him are his wife, his 3 daughters, and a priest, come to administer the last rites. This is his last chance, the final moment to secure his legacy in the eyes of God and man. The priest, along with the skeptical relatives gathered there, implores him to confess his sins, and chief among them, the magnificent fables and falsehoods with which he had entertained and scandalized Venice for 3 decades. They urge him, for the sake of his immortal soul, to retract the stories, to admit that he had exaggerated, to finally separate the fiction from the fact. The pressure in the room is immense. This is the moment for a final accounting, a deathbed confession that would confirm the suspicions of his critics and release him from the burden of his own incredible tale. But Marco, with what little strength he has left, pushes back. He refuses to recant. Instead, he utters the words that have become his epitaph, a final defiant cry against the smallness of the world that judged him. "I have not told," he insists, "half of what I saw." This single sentence is not a confession of lies, but a declaration of his ultimate truth. It is a statement of radical sincerity. He's not saying his book was false. He's saying it was tragically inadequate. The collapse is not his, but the world's failure of imagination. In this final, desperate act, he attempts to reclaim his narrative one last time, insisting that the reality he witnessed was so vast, so magnificent, and so far beyond the comprehension of his contemporaries that even his 1,000,000 lies did not come close to capturing its true scale. The finale of the hero's journey arrives not with the clash of swords or the fall of an empire, but in the quiet stillness of a bedroom in Venice. On the 8th of January, 1324, Marco Polo died. His end was profoundly, almost ironically, anticlimactic. The man whose life had been a whirlwind of movement across the deserts of Persia, the high passes of the Pamirs, the bustling cities of China, and the treacherous waters of the Indian Ocean, died at home, in his own bed. He was surrounded by family, by the tangible comforts of the great wealth he had successfully brought back from the East, and by the lingering scent of pepper and silk that had defined the commerce of his city. He was buried, as per his will, in the Church of San Lorenzo, a respectable but not overly grand resting place for a Venetian patrician. His death, like his later life, was that of a successful merchant, not a world historical figure. He left behind a city that had profited from his family's trade, that was entertained by his stories, but that ultimately refused to fully believe him. Venice, the gateway to the East, could not quite accept the testimony of the one man who had gone to its very heart and returned. The grand adventurer, the confidant of the great Khan, the man who had seen wonders beyond any European's imagining, was laid to rest as a slightly eccentric, fabulously wealthy, and fundamentally misunderstood citizen of the Republic. The great paradox of his life reached its conclusion. The man whose story was an epic of global proportions died a quiet, domestic death, his true legacy not yet understood, his name still hanging in the balance between that of a pioneer and a charlatan. the world he had described would remain, for most, a fantastical dream, the stuff of fireside stories, not yet the solid ground of geography and history. The ultimate legacy of Marco Polo is not a single, clear-cut verdict, but a profound and enduring conflict of interpretations. For centuries, and even today, he remains two different men, viewed through two different lenses. For one camp, the skeptics and rigorous historians, he is the great fabulist. They point to the glaring omissions, the Great Wall, tea, foot binding, and the lack of corroboration in Chinese sources as definitive proof that his story is, at best, a gross exaggeration, and, at worst, a complete fabrication. They argue that he was likely a merchant who never traveled much beyond the Black Sea or Persia, a clever man who compiled the stories he heard from other travelers along the Silk Road and presented them as his own first-hand experiences. His book, in this view, is a masterpiece of literary appropriation, not exploration. But for another camp, which has gained considerable ground with modern archaeological and textual analysis, Marco Polo was a remarkably accurate and truthful observer. They argue that the so-called omissions have plausible explanations. He may not have mentioned the Great Wall, because the sections he would have encountered were dilapidated earthen ramparts, far less impressive than the later Ming construction, and because, as a protected guest of the Mongols, walls meant to keep nomads out were of little consequence. He may not have mentioned tea because he moved in Mongol and Persian circles, where the preferred drink was kumis, fermented mare's milk. His descriptions of Yuan dynasty technologies and practices, such as the use of coal, paper money, and the imperial postal system, are astonishingly precise. His accounts of the geography of the Silk Road, the layout of cities like Dadu, Beijing, and the social structures of the Mongol court have been increasingly corroborated by archaeological finds and the study of Persian and Chinese texts. In this view, he is the first scientific ethnographer of Asia, a pioneer of empirical observation whose accuracy was so far ahead of his time that it was mistaken for fantasy. This duality is his true legacy. He is both a priceless source of verifiable historical data and the author of a narrative laced with myth and second-hand accounts. He exists forever in the gray area between fact and fiction. So, we return to the central dramatic paradox, the core question of our saga. Who was the real traveler, and who was the fiction? The final answer, pieced together from the evidence of his text, the context of his time, and the logic of his motivations, is that Marco Polo was neither a perfect witness nor a simple liar. The key to solving the paradox lies in a single word. He was a compiler. He was, without a doubt, a real traveler. The sheer weight of specific, verifiable detail in his book, particularly regarding Persia and the complex workings of the Mongol state, makes it almost certain that he spent many years within the orbit of the Yuan Empire. He truly saw the burning of black stones, the circulation of paper currency, and the magnificent efficiency of the Khan's messengers. He walked the streets of Dadu and saw the splendor of the imperial court. This was the factual core of his experience. However, his book is not a personal diary. It is an encyclopedic description of the world. Driven by an ambition to create the ultimate, definitive account of the East, he did not limit himself to what he had personally witnessed. Where his own experience was thin, particularly concerning the deep culture of the Han Chinese, or the geography of lands he was sent to investigate, but perhaps only skirted, he seamlessly wove in information gathered from others. The Silk Road was a river of stories, and he, with his keen ear and remarkable memory, was the perfect vessel to collect them. He gathered tales from Persian merchants, Mongol officials, and Nestorian Christians he met along his journeys. He synthesized their accounts with his own observations. Then, This grand compilation of first-hand experience and second-hand intelligence was passed through the final filter of Rustichello da Pisa, the Romance writer, who polished it, gave it a narrative arc, and seasoned it with the fantastic flourishes his audience craved. The fiction, therefore, was not that he lied about going to China, but that he presented this vast, compiled knowledge as a purely personal, first-hand testimony. He told the collective truth of the Silk Road, but framed it as the singular epic of Marco Polo. The verdict of history, then, is not about the guilt or innocence of a single man, but about the profound and often paradoxical power of a story. Marco Polo's universal lesson is that a compelling narrative can be more historically significant than the literal, fragmented truth it represents. He demonstrated that a story, even one laced with fiction and exaggeration, can reshape the world in a way that a dry, factual report never could. His book was not perfect, but it was effective. It was the right story at the right time. It seized the imagination of a Europe that was beginning to look beyond its own borders, providing a tangible, mesmerizing vision of a world of immense wealth and possibility. The true genius of Il Milione was its ability to operate on multiple levels. It was a practical guide for merchants, a tantalizing promise for adventurers, a strategic blueprint for popes and kings, and a work of breathtaking entertainment for the general reader. In the end, it matters less whether Marco Polo personally governed Yangzhou or saw every single one of the 12,000 bridges of Hangzhou. What matters is that he created a narrative powerful enough to convince others that such a world was real and attainable. He proved that history is often moved not by facts alone, but by the stories we choose to believe. His life is a testament to the idea that the person who successfully narrates the world is the one who truly changes it. He did not just describe the East, he invented a new version of it in the European mind, and in doing so, he provided the mental map that would lead directly to the dawn of a new global age. His journey's ultimate lesson is that the world is changed not only by those who explore it, but by those who can tell its most convincing tale. The final frame is not of Marco Polo in his prison cell or on his deathbed. It is a close-up, 2 centuries later, on a weathered, salt-stained book in the cabin of a ship plunging into the vast, terrifying emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean. The book is a Latin edition of The Description of the World. The hand holding it belongs to a Genoese navigator in the service of Spain, a man named Christopher Columbus. The margins of the book are filled with his feverish, spidery annotations. His finger traces the lines describing the island of Cipangu, located, according to Polo, some 1,500 miles off the coast of Cathay. He reads of a palace with a roof paved and tiled in pure gold, of streets littered with pearls and precious stones. Columbus has done his own calculations, wildly underestimating the circumference of the earth, and he is convinced that this island of treasure, this golden promise from Marco Polo's book, lies just a few weeks' sail to the west. The ghost of the Venetian merchant is his co-pilot, his whisper, the wind in the sails. Polo's story, a complex tapestry of truth, compilation, and literary flair, has become a concrete destination, a tangible target for a new generation of explorers. The final delicious irony is that the map Marco provided, whether entirely real or partially imagined, would not lead them to the old world he described, but would cause them to stumble blindly into a new world he could never have conceived. His book, a description of the past, became the catalyst for an unimagined future. The ink on the page, the voice from the Genoese prison, became the invisible thread pulling the ships of Europe over the edge of the known world, forever chasing the golden shadow of Marco Polo's magnificent, world-altering lie.